This is the Average Guy Network, and you have found Home Gadget Geeks, show number 337, recorded on December 14th, 2017. Here on Home Gadget Geeks, we cover all the favorite tech gadgets that primarily news, reviews, product updates, and conversation, all for the average tech guy. I'm your host, Jim Collison, broadcasting live from what feels like Florida. Mike, I have no idea what's going on with the weather, but I mean, we've had some windy days, but it's like 50 out there.
50. I mean, the wind makes it a little colder, but it's been great. And actually, the wind is great because all my leaves now are pushed to one side of the yard. So
I thought you were going to say all the leaves were pushed to your neighbor's yard. That would have been
in my backyard. So they're all at least just up against the fence. So now I just got to go out and scoop them into the bag.
Eric Janofsky is with us tonight, and Eric, you're in Southern California. You've got winds, but those aren't the things you're looking forward to, right? You got some. Are you near the fires at all, Eric? Welcome, by the way.
Thank you. We have no humidity though, so that's the problem.
Yeah, no, everything's super dry. You're safe, right, where you're at, and everything's good. But boy, man, Southern California is a mess at the moment. And man, we've talked about this before. We, of course, a lot of our listeners and a lot of our tech guys are in LA in that area, and so we just hearts go out to those who are affected by those fires. And there's lots of things going on. But Mike, the weather here in Nebraska, I'm feeling more and more like San Jose, California. That's my hometown, by the way. All the time. So if this is, I've said this before, this is what global warming's about. I'm all for it.
It's been nice.
It's brutal here in Nebraska. Of course, we post the show notes, and we're gonna have some really good ones because Erica did an amazing job with some show notes this week. You can catch all those at theaverageguy.tv. Don't forget, you can join us live on our mobile app as well. Best way to get a hold of the program is through our mobile app, homegadgetgeeks.com. There's just two buttons there. One says iPhone, one says Android. Boom, you're in. And a great way to listen to the program on the road. We want to thank LastPass for their sponsorship, another year of sponsorship for that app. And, of course, it's available at homegadgetgeeks.com. We want to thank Erin Lawrence for last week. Man, she's fantastic. Like
a pro.
Erin is,
absolutely.
I know. It's just we're privileged to have her.
Yeah, we really were. We gotta get her on more often.
Yeah, no, I think we're gonna go to quarterly with her. She is just dynamite. So and she
just
tweets
co-host. I'll bow out. I'll give it to her. Erin, if you're listening, you can have the chair.
She'd be pretty great. I'm not gonna lie, but I like having you.
I'll admit it. She's great.
I like having you. So Erin, thanks for coming on. She did a lot of social media tweeting this week too. She's just a pro. So Erin, thanks for coming on. I do want to remind you, we do have this thing called the post show. And last week we went into the post show. Erin didn't stay too long. Mike and I had I've been getting emails from some of you about wanting more cryptocurrency conversation. Now, some of you don't want it. So I've been trying to not work as much of it into the conversations what we're doing, but some of you want it. Last week, Mike and I felt like 5 hours, Mike. I think it was a long conversation.
It was midnight, I think, when you and I actually finally turned off the chat. So
it was a long conversation, and at times got a little, not offensive, but heated. Got a little. Mike and I disagreed on some things, and so if you're a Patreon supporter, I'm gonna go through that list really quick. We appreciate you guys, by the way, if you're a Patreon supporter. Both Eric and Mike support us here on Patreon. So gentlemen, thank you for your Patreon support. We always appreciate that. But if you are a Patreon subscriber, you get the post show. That's the only way to do it. That's just kind of one of those things, takes me extra time. And so I thought, we'll give it to the folks who are really serious and dedicated to the network. So $1 gets you in. You can head over to theaverageguy.tv/Patreon, or I think it's just go to the site. Go to theaverageguy.tv. Click on the Patreon link. $1 gets you in. You'll immediately get access to the post show. Now, it's long, but I'm telling you, you will never hear this kind of conversation between Mike and I.
That's right. Yeah, it's a rare. You got Mike unfiltered, which rarely happens, but you definitely got me unfiltered. So yeah, it was a great conversation, I think. But yeah, way different than what you and I than our usual banter, I guess.
Yeah,
so
it was
fun.
The gloves almost came off at one point, and
it
was Mike. I just want to say though, super nice to podcast with you. No foul words. No, I hate you. No rage quitting.
Right.
All those things could happen. We can
have fun with it. That's we built up that rapport. So
yeah. So if you want to get access to that, there's like an hour and a half or 2 hours of it out on Patreon. But we do that.
Another podcast.
we do make the post show available to all our Patreon subscribers. Again, $1. Brian Auer, Paul Brerin, Michael Ray, MB Gilbertson, Kevin Schoonover, Justin Simmons, John Biggs, Dennis Pillow, Nathaniel Lindley, Chad Davis, Mark Robson, Ryan Kirshner, Jay Cleveland Payne, John Larson, Chad Johnson, Gavin Campbell, Emily Prokop of the Story Behind, by the way, a great podcast you should subscribe to and listen to. Eric Janofsky. Eric, thank you for your sponsorship here. Peter Dennett, Jim Shoemaker, Dwayne Johnson, Malcolm Lacey, Mike Wieger, and then Steve Sleeper over at the North Omaha History Podcast. So, gentlemen and ladies, we thank you for your support of the show. Always appreciate you guys doing that. A buck gets you in. And, of course, you can listen to the Wild post show. That was last week. I also want to say, and Eric, great week to have you on. You're a Kangaroo user. I'm a Kangaroo user. Mike's a Kangaroo user. And Keith, that we know of. I know there's some other that bought it. I think, but between Keith, you and I, we have all replaced those at this point. Did yours heat up to the temperature of the sun? Is that kind of what happened?
That's right. It was also placed in a warm location, which I was running a fan, and I had strapped a hard drive to it.
Yeah.
That'll
So you have
surprising.
You have the version that is a docking station, and you can put a hard drive in that docking station. And what I found is if you put a spinner in there, that adds additional heat to the setup. And so you have a device. These Kangaroos really aren't vented very well. It's kind of air cooled, and I don't know if that works very well. Mike, you and I looked online, and we had some folks that were complaining about this. And if you're running a Boink, like that's running all the time, that really contributes to it. Eric, how do you use your
I'm using it as a backup device. I have running and a VPN server, so I'm running at a family member across the country, another Kangaroo, and we'll back up to each other, and it's pretty on all the time, communicating.
Right.
Yeah, and they stay pretty warm. If they're on all the time, they stay pretty warm.
So I'm wondering if
that's generous being warm.
Yeah, that's true. You can cook a pizza on it. It's like, yeah, just set your frozen pizza on there, and you'll have it'll be done cooking in a while. But my question, I wonder if, so I do not have the double deck version, right? Mine's the original, so it doesn't have the spinner underneath. Maybe keeps it a little cooler. And then I think I was the only one out of the three of you who was running Linux instead of Windows. Maybe Linux runs a little cooler. Probably not. It's probably
run cooler for me.
It didn't.
Yeah, I ran Linux for a while too.
Okay, I just I was like, yeah, I don't know why mine hasn't done that
Ubuntu.
yet.
I ran an Ubuntu, a distro of Ubuntu, and it did the same.
And that's what I was doing, because I was doing the Boink software, and I was cranked up for a year. But it's just been,
And yours is not showing any signs. So for Keith Lunsford, his popped up, and then mine popped up. But Keith and I were for the same reason. The lithium ion battery pack expanded. Let's just put it that way. It became a balloon. I'm kind of thankful it didn't catch fire. Eric, for you,
I'm worried. It's in my living room.
I know. This is kind of just maybe a public service.
Yeah.
This is a public service announcement. Eric, yours just got so hot the plastic melted. Was that what happened?
Well, the adhesive that secured the top to the
gotcha. Yep.
to the case.
Yep. Just released, really gave up the ghost, so to speak. Now, did you send it back to them? Have they replaced it?
Yeah, they replaced it.
Yeah.
It took about
pretty much no questions asked, right?
Yeah, they wanted it, and by the time I wrote to them, sent it back, it was 3 weeks. Really, it was less than a week and a half since they had the device and sent it back. So
yeah, same with me. I contacted their support. They said no problems, and I had even gotten it as part of a review unit. So I hadn't even paid for it. They wanted the receipt, and I was like, "Well, actually, I worked with the guys at InFocus, and they gave me this as a review unit. I'm willing to buy a new battery for it." And they're like, "No, we just want to replace it." So they gave me an RMA, sent it in a box. They gave it within a week. It was back, and in fact, it came back so fast. When the box came, I was opening it thinking it was something else that I'd ordered, and then boom, there was the Kangaroo, brand new cables. I probably refurb, to be honest, but it came back. So great support. Keith also had said, and we tweeted this as well, that the InFocus guys gave pretty good support and pretty good turnaround on those. Eric, are you going to do anything different to that now, knowing that they run a little hot? Is there anything that you're doing different?
Well, I'm going to make sure it's in a better ventilated area and One unit didn't have the slide-in drawer for the disk drive, so I'm separating the disk drive from the processing unit.
Okay. Yeah, and I actually loaded an SSD in the back of mine to give it that second drive. So I have like a 60 gig SSD back there. Not a lot, but I don't use it for a lot. And then I too, we were talking about this in the pre-show. At some point I took a glass that had a flat bottom and I put ice in it and water. It actually worked. It kept it cool. I'd come down a couple days later, the water would be temperate, kind of warm. Active cooling is what I called it, active water cooling. But yeah, I think, we talked those Kangaroo PCs up a bunch. We had Paul on here from InFocus talking about it. If you own one of those, you might want to check it. And Eric, to your point, you might want to make sure it's in a well ventilated place. And then Mike, for you, I would say just inspect that thing about once a week.
Well, I think I might put a plate underneath it or something. So, because it's just sitting on our, the built-in cupboard where our TV is, easily catch fire or melt or something. So maybe just put a plate so that if it did balloon up, it would be on something that's not flammable.
The battery pack was expanded. I mean, it was a balloon by the time I got to it. And so, just be careful, I guess is what we're saying. I always, want to be responsible about some of the recommendations that we've made. Great little device. They've sent me a new one. Maybe they fix those issues. I don't know, but be careful. If you've got it hidden away in a spot and it doesn't have great ventilation, probably go time to check on it and make sure that it is getting good ventilation. I also thought about getting one of those aluminum, maybe that's not the right kind of metal, but a heat sink, from the old school heat sinks that are square, and just setting that thing a little thermal paste and setting it right on top to help dissipate, because the whole thing is a heat sink. It just dissipates it right through the case. And so you might want to think about getting the heat out somewhere else. So a little public service announcement on that. All right, Eric, we had you on because I put out a call a while back and said, hey, I'd love to talk about old school, or vintage is what we're going to call it from here on out, kind of this vintage technology, and talk with listeners, primarily listeners, because nobody else would just show up for the show. I mean, I said this, so it's going to be listeners who have a background in tech and have some stories to tell. And I think people always I'm terribly fascinated by, we had Paul Teen on here talk about how he kind of started the NAS. No, I shouldn't say started, was a big player in the NAS space. Eric, before we get started, though, before we dig into what you're doing, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you've had a couple careers, you've done a couple things, you're retired now, but give us the 2-minute sales or elevator pitch on who you are.
Elevator pitch. So I've been involved in technology since, I don't know, preteen. My dad was an engineer and bring home gadgets, and we'd work on projects together. And I'll go through some of that later on. I have a master's in electrical engineering, worked for the New York City power company, Con Ed, went to law school, became a patent attorney. And how does patent attorney relate to technology? I mean, I've seen technology before it became publicly available, and worked with some of the smartest people you can meet. I've worked in industries such as worked for Epson, involved in their printer technology, and learned about image processing. Worked for Marvell Semiconductor, learned about signal processing, digital electronics, design of chips. And my last job was with Lam Research Company, and they're the companies who make the equipment that makes the chips. So an Intel or a TSMC or a Samsung would buy that equipment, and I don't know how it works. I mean, I understand the theory behind it, but I don't know how you can make billions of chips reliably, and you could buy chips for pennies, or you could buy processors, in the $100 range. And so
yeah.
That is so cool. I'm just nerding out, so jealous that you're a patent attorney, because that was what I wanted to be. I actually went into law school, and of course, I didn't look into the requirements. I thought, okay, you're a lawyer. Well, patent is the one kind of area of law where you actually need to take the patent bar. It's like you need to take twice. You need to take the bar and then be a patent attorney as well. And they have requirements for certain specific undergraduate degrees, and they call them like the hard sciences, right? So engineering, obviously, perfect for that. Any sort of chemical stuff, biochem, anything like that. Even some computer science programs from accredited schools count, but I did not have one of those undergraduate degrees. So I was like, oh man, I was just so like, just my dreams were dashed. I couldn't be a patent attorney after that, or else I would have to go back and get a whole nother undergrad degree. But so I just love it. I can't wait to hear more stories about like, kind of what you saw in your years, because like you said, you see all the cool stuff before it comes out. And that's awesome.
Well, and Eric, you've lived through a time when patents have been under more scrutiny than they've ever been, right?
Yep.
I mean, just think about all the patent wars we've had over. Were you in that space? I mean, could you feel the tension in the patent space?
Oh, absolutely. Some of the litigations I was involved in had to go with Wi-Fi, and it was really interesting. I was in Australia last summer, and going through a tour, and they're talking about Australia, and there was a CSIRO, which is their quasi-government research agency, had some patents which they enforced against pretty much everybody who built a Wi-Fi device. And one of the things the tour guide was saying was that we invented Wi-Fi. Not totally true. They invented, if anything, they invented a modulation technique for handling secondary signals bouncing off objects. Interesting fact, one of the 802B had a modulation technique, and each of the 802B, AC added a different modulation technique that improved Wi-Fi. Do you have any idea when direct sequence spread spectrum was invented, and by whom?
No, not a clue.
Invented during World War II by an intelligence officer who was an actress named Hedy Lamarr.
Oh, really?
So go Google Hedy Lamarr.
Hedy Lamarr.
Yes.
So did all of
LAMAR.
those, as they went through the progressions, like you said, N, AC, did that all fall into the same patent or not?
Well, because they included multiple modulation techniques, if
Right.
you had a patent that covered direct sequence spread spectrum, which was patented shortly after World War II,
Okay.
patent expired, but it
Right.
would have been covered if
Gotcha.
if the patent was alive.
So Hedy Lamarr, American-Australian film actress.
Or Austria.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. Austrian-born American film actress and inventor.
Huh.
So you're saying
Look
she
at that
invented
combo.
that. Man, that's pretty sweet.
Yeah.
She invented direct sequence spread spectrum. I can't pronounce it.
Spread spectrum. That's hard to say.
It is hard to say. It's a tongue twister.
That's hard to say. Yeah. Well, I think, there's a lot of that in that space where, when we think of Bell Labs and we think of and IBM and a lot of the research that was going into this in the 50s and 60s. My dad started working for IBM in 56, I want to say 57. All those technologies went in, they were cranking out. And I'm not sure, and maybe you know better than Eric, maybe better than I, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of attention being played to the patents in those days. This was a lot of stuff that just needed to get out, especially some of this technology you think during World War II, right? A lot of our radar technology, a lot of the radio stuff that we use today came out of a lot of the technologies came out of World War II. Not as worried about the patents as they were just getting the stuff working. Did that seem, first of all, is that a correct assumption that 50s and 60s, not as much so, but 70s and 80s and 90s, more so attention to patents, and it really becomes important? Is that a correct assumption or is it different?
Okay, we'll talk in general.
Yeah.
Patents became more important in early 1980s. when Congress and passed a bill which was signed by the president that has established the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And that court had jurisdiction over all patent appeals. Now, before that, if you were in California, an appeal to a patent case would go to the Ninth Circuit. If it was in East Coast New York, it would go to the Second Circuit. And so sometimes, as with many issues, you could get different results.
Yeah.
And there would be some forum shopping so you get the right appeals code. But the patent statutes were enabled by the Constitution. And it's one of the few sets of laws, subject matter, that Congress felt it was necessary to have a uniform approach.
Yep.
It's unlike, for example, where there's jurisdiction based on diversity. That is, someone from state A is suing for something from state B, meeting other requirements, you could go into federal court, and it may have to do with negligence. Well, there's a whole body of law on negligence in each state's law, and so that's fine. But when dealing with an issue where there's uniformity, it made sense to have a single court of appeals.
Yeah, and I think kind of standardize it across the United States.
Yes.
Which helped greatly. I think now we have a global problem with it, and of course, that we now have different systems, and that's probably neither here nor there, and way probably more complicated outside of the scope of what we're going to talk about here. But
yeah.
Eric, where'd you grow up, and what are your early technology? For me, like my earliest, like really nerdy things, or we programmed on 8088s when I was in high school, and I had a Timex Sinclair 1000. Those are some of the early, like for me. But for you, you're just a year older, you're 2 older than me. So what do you remember? what are some of those early memories for you?
So if you can't tell by my accent, I'm from Queens, New York, and I was listening to Peter King be interviewed by I forgot the announcer from CNN, Cuomo, and both were born in Queens, and one was arguing that he didn't have a Queens accent. But I'm proud of my Queens accent, and I'm from New York. So some of the things was, I'll call it the Eric Janofsky 1. And they were built on PNP transistors. Today's current technology is CMOS transistors. And they were bipolar transistors, and they didn't switch off. Transistors were about this big, and they were 20 transistors, because each flip-flop had 2 transistors. And to give you an idea, it was just basically an adder. But let's say, which you can't do, you built my computer into today's technologies where there are billions of transistors. And let's assume we just build a chip with 1 billion transistors, so the math works out. So each transistor required about 2 watts. And they were about 3 square inches. And we had about 40 transistors, and the square area, the area of the transistors, let alone the resistors, capacitors, it's about 62 square inches. And let's assume today's, I said a billion, I mean 5 billion. That would be, I'm looking at my number, 200 billion square inches. And would require, and assuming that each nuclear power plant generated 1 gigawatt, you'd require 200 nuclear power plants
to run. So what you're saying, the equivalent then to what we run today would require how many nuclear power plants?
200.
200 just for the one board, because those were
no, a full.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Right. A 5 billion transistor circuit.
Right.
Wow.
And it would take an area of 78 square miles. and you look at that and you say, this is the miracle of
Yeah.
electronics, that you could buy the chip of 5 billion transistors almost for the amount that I paid for one PNP transistor.
Yeah, Moore's law, right? Kicking in.
Moore's law, but
Real,
I thought that would be a good way of looking at it, not just, on this curve,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
what the requirements of power and area would be.
Right. No, that's a great calculation when you kind of boil. I've never heard it put that way. By the way, when you said about this big, you did this on the camera, about a size of a quarter,
Yes.
right? For our audio listeners. And I wonder how many of our listeners remember those days as well. That'd be interesting to
Sure.
have them chime in as well as we think about, sending the stuff in. But yeah, what a huge, when we think about that in each year better and smaller. And, what was your first real introduction to this space? What was the first thing you built that actually had purpose and use?
Oh, I built a touch switch, and it comprised one tube, capacitors, resistors, and it was basically some sort of amplifier, and I don't remember what. When you touched it, you changed the frequency, and that caused this a relay to engage or disengage. Now, if we switch to relays, if you remember, you could always tell an old phone company building because they had very tall floors, lots of air conditioning, and the reason they were tall was so they could stack racks and racks of relays to perform the switching. And they had no windows, just ventilation. And
yeah, okay, so this is great because we've got a couple of buildings here in Omaha. There's still holdovers from the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the phone company, they would build a building, and I'm assuming they'd fill it up with these relays, and then they'd more people, so they would build another building next to it. No windows, and there's these Bell buildings all around the city of Omaha. And so I'm assuming that's what they were putting. Because I always thought, like, how hard is it to really do phones? Like, do you really need? What the heck were they putting in these buildings? But you're saying to get the phones to work in these switches, they had to have these big buildings with a lot of relays. Is what you're saying?
And that was the first time. And 1962, the Bell system introduced touch tone, and so they didn't have to have the relays. And they started using semiconductors, transistors, to do the dialing and interpret the dialing.
Yeah, because the relays were doing it before. It's funny.
Relays,
I know nothing about
that was
old
going to
school
be my
phone.
question, though. I was going to ask the same thing. Okay, so how did that change?
Well, okay. Do you understand the theory of rotary dialing?
No.
Nope.
Okay. We could throw my notes out and talk about rotary dialing.
Real quick, summarize it.
Okay, basically, you dial had a switch, and and a spring that would cause it. As you dial the one, it would send, I think, 2 pulses of different. There's a mechanical switch of different length, and then it would be in. If you dial the 3, it would send 4 pulses, one to begin and the rest of the different length. And you use these relays to count.
Oh, okay.
And then you had, all these numbers, and then you would get the combination of numbers, and you'd switch. They didn't have area codes to begin with. And you would dial, and whatever your number was, 1, 2, 3 would be the prefix which related to a geographic area, and then 4 digits.
Yeah, and they used letters in the very beginning,
Yes.
right? They would spell things in the very beginning. Not as many phone numbers, you could do that, right? And then they switch over to the numbers, and then later would introduce area codes. But no, that's fascinating because I always thought, why did the phone company need such big buildings to make this work? And it was all these relays that were in there. I remember as a kid, because we still had touch tone didn't come along till late 70s.
Yeah, it started. Yeah, late 70s.
So we still had rotary phones, and I remember you'd be in a hurry, and you would dial it, and then you would push it back so you could, because it'd go faster. Otherwise, because you had to does it go? I think it goes to the right. You would dial to the right, and then you
Yeah,
let it
dial
go.
to right and
Let it go. Wieger,
spring-
you've never dialed a phone, have you?
I've played with one that wasn't plugged in. You're right, but I have never actually dialed a phone that way. No.
Okay, and let's just say dial up, right? The term dial up. The dial is gone, right? I mean, the dial was gone in the early 80s. Like nobody dialed. That was the whole thing, right? You would dial. Well, when touch tone went away, it was just push buttons. But that term dial carried over. And when these modems start coming online here in the 80s, 70s, 80s and stuff, they carried that dial because it was a dial tone, right? You'd pick it up before you dial and you'd listen, right, Eric? You'd listen to the phone and make sure, okay, now I can dial, right? So it's interesting how that term dial goes from, and it becomes dial up. And now what's crazy is we say in corporate, we say, well, I'm going to dial in. If you're going to join a conference call, right? You say, oh, I'm going to dial in. Nobody's dialing anymore. I mean, we haven't dialed in 30 years, 40 years, right, Eric?
Yeah, that's about right. I think.
Yeah.
I never knew where that term came from. So
Isn't that funny? Yeah, the rotary, the rotary, and those. Would it actually create? Because it was when you were spinning the dial, it was actually crossing something, right? That was creating that click.
Contacts.
Yeah.
In behind the dial, and in those days, you leased the phone from the phone company.
Oh, really? Those weren't owned.
Oh, you weren't owned, and you couldn't get one. Sometimes you were able to get one, and of course, I had to take one apart.
Of course you did. Of course you did.
They had you received the DC signal from the phone from the central office, and to go through a hybrid because you had your microphone and your speaker. It was a carbon microphone, and use the DC, and you modulate the DC to get the. And it was big and heavy until.
Yeah.
The hybrid was just a fancy inductor that separated the signal.
Yeah, it's those early phones. There's interesting history in that. But you have in your notes, Eric, you said 64 World's Fair in New York, which I'm assuming you were at. Bell Systems introduced the first picture phone in 64.
Yes.
Talk to me about that, because I would have thought maybe that would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, but already in 64.
They introduced at the fair. Very few people had one, if any. I don't know anyone who had one. I mean, it would be a business. It was about the size, I don't know, foot by 6 inches, and I don't know what that was the unit itself, and it had a CRT, cathode ray tube, and a camera, and some connections. I never knew what was also equipment that was supporting it. But when we went to the Bell exhibit, there'd be 2 booths, or there were multiple pairs of booths, and you could speak to it. It was very expensive to own, very expensive to use. I just don't know anyone who used or had one or seen one outside the World's Fair.
Yeah, 64 was a little early, and you had to be a super early adopter and have really good. I mean, the picture would be bad. The audio would not be great. You just didn't have enough data stream at that point, right?
Yep.
And in 64, you really don't have any even kind of centralized network across the United States yet. I mean, you have phone lines and you can call across the United States, but it's going through, I think, wouldn't you say it's going to go through a whole bunch of switching to even, if you want to go New York to San Francisco, you're going to go through a bunch of relays to get there, right?
They may have had the solid state circuits, but that being said, I don't have enough information to say what would happen, even if they could support a signal from New York to New Jersey, let alone New York to California.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure Bell Labs had some specialized, I'm not sure. It is likely Bell Labs had some specialized circuits that could support cross-country communication.
In the World's Fair, were they basically doing it from one booth to another? Was that kind of it's pretty easy? Yeah. What do you remember thinking? Because for me, my first aha moment was in '84 when I was watching Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he gets on a video phone, right? He's on Mars or something a part of the movie, and they do a video phone, and I go, oh man, this is the future. Now, this is 20 years before that. What are you thinking when you see this thing? What's it do? I mean, what do you start thinking?
I thought it was interesting technology, but it's not something that the average citizen could afford or have any use for. It was practical science fiction. Here's something we could do, but how do we monetize it? I think one other important thing to understand is the business environment. The Bell system was a monopoly. They controlled 90+% of the telephone service between in the United States. There were some other small companies like GTE and some very local, rural spaces, but there was no competition. You could not put your own phone equipment on the system.
Yeah.
So there was no incentive to lower prices. To today, if Apple comes up with an iPhone, Samsung came up with and Google came up with an Android Galaxy, right? And they have competition, and they not only compete on price but features and other things like battery life. That there was none of that, so I think that stymied innovation, because let's see, what can we build that people will pay for, rather than let's build something and I know that people will pay this amount. If it costs that amount, I'm not going to enter the field, and I got to be better and cheaper than my competitor. It was no competition.
Like the cable companies, AT&T and Bell and Bell companies had invested an enormous amount of money into the infrastructure to make all this work.
Absolutely.
And so they're protecting their investment. It's just a different day, right? We see this in our cable companies today. There's not a lot of difference in a lot of those. Sometimes we feel like they're, then they charge a lot to get this stuff done. I mean, a cable bill these days is expensive, right? And what's so funny, I remember in the late 80s, my phone bill was maybe $100 or $120, which was a lot, right? When you think about 80, well, let's say $90, $92, $93. And I did everything I could to get off of the landline. And so I was early on the voice over IP stuff, and I really, and then it didn't, then prices dropped so low, it didn't matter anymore, right? The phone was irrelevant. You saw some other things though, Eric, at that World's Fair in '64. What else did you see there that kind of piqued your interest?
Okay. IBM had an exhibit, and they said in the future, everybody will have a computer. And I walked into and they had these big refrigerator. If you ever seen a mainframe, they're just big crates full of electronics and disk drives that were big as washing machines, and printers, I don't know, bigger than your kitchen oven. And I said to myself, because we lived in an apartment, that can't be possible. In fact, I only knew people lived in apartments, because there'd be no place to store the computer.
Right.
And I thought, until they, makes no sense. But where are we today? We have something more powerful than the computer on the lunar rover.
Yeah. Well, we saw, we were saying early in the show, you got a couple kangaroos. Mike, how many PCs do you think you have? I have 9, by the way. How many PCs do you think you have in the house there?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, exactly.
7. Yeah.
Exactly. Isn't that crazy?
If you include a Raspberry Pi, 8, and if you include the phones and iPads, 11.
Yeah.
But strictly PCs, 8.
Yeah. Eric, isn't that crazy? Again, so for me, hearing for maybe that same idea for the first time in the late 70s through IBMers saying, hey, this idea of personal computing is coming, and thinking, I never even see, you saw a big box. I never saw that. I saw some smaller boxes, and I was thinking, oh, this is going to be great. Like this one, when this gets here as a kid, as a teenager, I remember thinking this is going to be awesome. You had to have some awe though, looking at this, thinking about how great it could be, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. You know, but not as much awe as looking back today, where we have basically universal compute power. We have compute as a service.
Mm-hmm.
And the innovation these days is not the computer, but the growing innovation is what you can do with the computer. And you don't have to sit there and program and be someone who's technically has great technical knowledge to program in whatever language of the day it is. But you know, it's designing the systems and what benefits can you get from these systems.
Yeah, Mike and I have been doing a lot of work on cryptocurrency, Mike, and I think, think about that. We don't know how to program it.
Right.
We're just like, you and I have integrated 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 different systems to make this thing work recently. I have an Azure instance running. I'm doing some mining in the cloud. I don't even own the box. It's running on a virtual server somewhere.
Completely.
Right.
And I think when you brought up earlier, the rise of patents and the importance of patents, that was kind of a big year too, when it started to transition into the shift to what computers can do. Any Joe in his basement can start writing code. They don't need a factory just to create this new computer or physical item. So the demand for patents was enormous, and especially because I can create something, odds are there is someone else out there that's creating that same thing. So I need to patent this. Whereas back in the olden days, if you were inventing something physical, the odds were a lot less that someone out there was creating the exact same thing. Or at least the odds were a lot less that there were as many people creating the exact same thing at the same exact time. So I think that was also another boom. I know, Eric, you talked about earlier in the 80s, back, when Congress enacted it. But I think another one was when, like you just mentioned, computers started to be more about what can computers do. That was a good way to put it. I like that too. It's not like it's like what can computers do compared to the computer focus. And we saw that in smartphones not too long ago, where we stopped focusing on the hardware. We were all into, okay, what does this phone have? What kind of cameras does this have? And we're still a little bit like that, but now it's, okay, what features does this phone offer over this one, software wise, not hardware wise?
I mean,
Eric,
you could say
go
the
ahead.
same thing with the car, right? What could you do
Oh, that's
with
a good point. Yeah.
right? And now we have trucking industries, overnight delivery. We have car as a service called Uber, Lyft, or the like. It's Henry Ford didn't think about that.
Yeah, no, he was thinking about replacing a carriage, right?
Yes.
Replacing the horse. Hey, in 64, speaking of cars, you also saw this car is very near and dear to my wife's heart, by the way. She has models of it. We have calendars of it. It's I think she's replaced me with the car. You saw a special car there in 64. What'd you see?
Oh, I forgot. What?
You saw a Ford Mustang for the first
Oh
time.
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
It's not in my notes.
No,
I wasn't a big car enthusiast, so.
Yeah. But the 2-seater, that the very first, we think about a car that revolutionized kind of the sports car. I mean, it was an early, sleek, sports car that would become a icon in the late 60s. 68, 69, and 70 would become just amazing and would really put Ford on the map for sports car industry. Not a lot of tech. Those cars are pretty simple, but it did change things. If you think about the vehicles in the 50s and 60s being big and bulky and space age, right?
Yeah.
That's what they thought was space age. Speaking of space age, what about robots? Did you see anything in that 64 World's Fair around robots?
They did robotic animation. Disney did it, and they had Abe Lincoln speaking, a robot. And he spoke a little bit, but that was another technology that was introduced.
The PC has so dominated our thought and innovation process, and today, I think if you were born in the last, well, maybe for you, Mike, let me think about this, that we're only now seeing the really big advancements in robots, right? I mean, I think it was pretty stale. If we think from 60, this was 64. If we go from 64 to maybe 94, robots, I don't think make and Eric, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. Not a lot of innovation with those, but it seems like in the last 10 years, we're seeing tons of innovation on the robot side. Eric, what do you respond to that? Am I wrong? Am I right?
I think robotics have been around, some very sophisticated robots by NASA. Look, some going up to Mars, going to the moon, but it wasn't within the reach of, even the top 2%, wealthiest 2%. It was basically government funded. Same thing. Russia had some robotics that went up to the moon, and what we have now is that they're industrial robots. We have consumer robots, and you can include the quadcopters in there. But that technology has been enabled by cheap electronics, by processes and sensors that can control things. It's been around, but not as sophisticated. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, if you've seen, this robotic surgery, it's not going to be in everybody's house, but it's based on some core technology.
So you're kind of telling me like we needed the PC first to revolutionize the chip, because Mike, we couldn't fly your drones if we didn't have small enough chips. I mean, if we were trying to run the reason I mean, maybe drones and stuff were held up for so long is because the chips to your point earlier, Eric, the chips consumed more power than was efficient enough for a battery to be able to keep them in the air for 20 minutes.
And to be safe enough.
Yeah.
Right? You got to have a pretty good chip on there
enough
for the average person to be able to have a drone and be safe with it, right? I need to be able to see where I'm going. Like, there's a lot of things you need to be able to do. So yeah, I think a drone's a perfect example.
Right. Not cheap enough. So if your processor cost $1,000, that's where your drone would start adding up all the other components. But when you can get a ARM-based processor, in the tens of dollars, then you could put those in consumer electronics where you can, that require them.
Right.
Yeah, right. The smaller form factor, smaller energy. Was helping Michael Ray in the Facebook group this morning. He had took a picture of the screen and from the system, the Windows system screen, and said, "Hey, I've got this AMD processor. I have this much RAM. I've got, how do I make this thing faster?" And so I went back and I just kind of doing a little bit of research on his chip, and it was an AMD processor from 2015. Still actually a pretty good, robust processor, but very power or energy efficient, 25 watts max on these things. And it's one of those things. I bought an AMD box from Schoonover at the Home Server Show meetup this year, and that thing I think is 15 or 20, and you just think, wow. I mean, that is now, granted, you're not running huge stuff on them, but they are pretty powerful, efficient. Eric, you just mentioned ARM. And I think, not to use a pun, but I think we're going to be off on an arms race here over the next 5 years as Qualcomm and the ARM side begin to really compete with Intel on the small space for Windows devices. On the phones, they've already won, right? It's Intel's out of the phone space, right? I mean, it's all ARM chips there, and man, they are making innovation in the ARM space. Eric, were you involved on the processor side with ARM? Have you in the work that you've done, have you worked in that area?
Yeah, on the legal side, but
yeah, on the legal side of it. But you're still seeing, it seems like the ARM guys are just crushing it right now with innovation after innovation after innovation, getting those things smaller and more efficient and more powerful. Would that be true?
That's true, but I think there's another factor, because when I was at Marvell, they switched over from MIPS to ARM, and the reason was there's this installed base, so there's a lot of inertia. So even if you had an Intel x86 that was as power efficient, same smaller footprint it would be very difficult to move over to, an x86 processor from ARM. So you have a lot of history and inertia that makes it difficult to change. And you've seen this on the PC side. AMD had to be x86 compatible. You don't see, for example, Motorola and IBM had the PowerPC. It was a RISC processor, and in fact, Apple moved from PowerPC to Intel. And so, if they're in a lot of devices, it's really the software that's driving the compatibility with the software.
Yeah.
And, Microsoft, I don't have that great a detail, but is putting some sort of virtual machine to run Windows 10 on ARM.
Yeah. An emulator, basically, right?
Right, emulator, right.
To help bridge the gap for their x86 apps until they kind of switch over to ARM, right?
Yeah.
It's early, but I think eventually we're going to see most of Windows on ARM, and most people running their most of their normal stuff. I think creators, filmmakers, photographers, these high intensive, although Mike, there was some new Mac announcement recently, and this new Mac has like
18 cores. Yeah, you can get it up to 18 cores.
Yikes.
In an iMac that's like this thin. It's a desktop with no tower anything.
Yeah.
Radeon graphics.
Yeah, unbelievable. Other Jim says in the chat room that battery size made consumer robots possible as well.
Sure.
And I think, Eric, have you been involved, or have you seen any of the battery technologies? Was that a part of your work at all as they got smaller and more efficient, or is that kind of outside of your scope? Okay.
That was outside of my experience.
Yeah, certainly we've made, and yet, Brian he works around a lot of batteries. He works for a company, I think still, that does battery recycling. I still think we have a long way to go in battery technology. It's just it's one of those, I don't know, maybe Brian will have to come on and school us in the battery space, but it seems like, I've got my phone and it's 3 years old, and what's going to fail on this thing first is the battery, right? At this point. So, and I could replace it, I guess, but I'm not going to, I'm going to buy a new one.
Not very easy on that iPhone, right?
Say it again, Mike?
Not very easy to do that on the iPhone.
No, just because of the way they built it.
Yeah, the way they built it.
So. Yeah, but I could take it in, and for $150 or whatever, right? They could replace the battery for me. I'm not gonna. We talked about this last week with Aaron. I think I'm gonna go with the 8S or the 8 Plus. And what?
This is my battery replacement, the 10.
Oh, you got the 10. Nice.
You made the right choice.
I see. That's why you were.
Yeah, I'm trying to guilt.
I don't know. I think I saw an 8 Plus yesterday, and I like it. I like the size of it. I like and then I think it was Kyle in the Facebook group that said do the 8 Plus now, and then 18 months from now, get on sprints, always upgradable. They have and then by that time, the 10 will have its S version out, and then go on the 10S. So,
or do a 7, which is even cheaper, because the 7 and this is not. I'm not trying to be a diss, but they're so similar that you wouldn't notice the difference if it's just a new phone. Yeah, you will not notice the difference. Oh. So you could do a 7 and then do that same thing in a year, upgrade to the 10.
Okay. So 7 Plus is because I want to go with the bigger. I do want to try a big.
Right. Yeah, so I think a 7 Plus, the difference between 7 Plus and 8 Plus is not much at all, if anything. So
okay, Eric, what made you go right to the 10?
It's a little smaller than the Plus. I wanted the camera with my grandchildren, and I always like to get the newer technology. And I'm happy with Apple. They don't seem to have too many problems. Yeah, some software fixable things, but
no, they do all right. I think it's a mature platform. Emily in the chat room saying she's loving Mark. Her husband just got a Pixel 2, and I thought of actually going the Google route with Project Fi. I think I can get that here in Omaha. My kids are on it. Actually, we're an Android family, except Sammy and I. Who go figure that it would be the two of us that would be still on iPhones, but I don't know. I don't know. Okay, neither here nor there. Eric, what else? What else you want to share with us? What other, when we think about memories or we think about technology, what else? You had a in here. You had a note about Motorola,
Yeah.
and Motorola. Mike, did you know that Motorola used to not make telephones? That they were actually a company, they were a radio company before. Did you know that?
I did not. I had a Motorola flip phone,
Yeah.
and that was my first experience with Motorola.
Yeah, Eric, what was Motorola before they were the phone company?
They were basically a two-way radio company, commercial and military. And,
Really?
Yep.
Yeah, that was not their space. Like if you bought a walkie-talkie, by the way, Brian Regan has a great skit on walkie-talkies, but if you bought a walkie-talkie or two-way radios, those were Motorola's. I mean, they were known for their communication devices. The phones came later.
Until recently, municipalities and governments would have Motorola radios in patrol cars and any other.
Yeah, CB radios, right? There was a lot of Motorola CBs.
CDs, but they started commercialized. So when you had a bigger market, you had other companies like Cobra and someone else. I don't remember having a CB radio by Motorola. I think I had a Cobra CB radio.
Well, that was they were the market leaders, right? At that point, Cobra was the big. I had a CB when I can't. This is awful that I'm admitting this. I had, and when I was in high school, I had a CB, and I think we've talked about this before, but I'd go around. Eric, did you ever CB radio? Did you get into that craze at all in your car?
Yeah, I used to travel up to Vermont skiing, so I wanted some sort of mobile communication device. So I had a CB.
Yeah, and we would. So this would have been 80s. They've had some resurgence, right? In the 70s during the Convoy era. Yeah. There was an album that came out. There was a big surge. This would have been like 74, and then in the early 80s, they made a resurgence again. And that was when I was in high school. And I put one in my mom's car, wired it in, I just hacked it in the car. It was awful. I did a terrible job. Big antenna coming out of this little tiny car. And then we would do these games where we'd go around town and one person would go hide and they would key up, right? You push the key. And then everybody would have to go around and find them based on the meter on your CB radio for the frequency meter, right? How strong or how weak. So people would drive around. Gas was $1 a gallon. So just get off my back. So we would literally just drive around for hours trying to find these people that were hidden. And it was hide and seek using CB radios.
That was awesome. I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know you could even do that with CB.
Yeah, because they all had these meters, right? It had the strength meter when somebody would.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it was the early. I mean, that's what nerds did. That's what technology nerds did in the early 80s, right? I mean, there was some computer stuff going on as well, but we did that as well. Go ahead, Eric.
Before we end, and I don't know how long you want to go. I thought I'd say something interesting that probably most people did not know, that up until the 70s, we used analog computers. They weren't fast enough. So one of the applications was what would happen to lightning striking a power line. The current, and again, these were simulations that were run by big companies. So they had computer resources available, but there wasn't enough computing power to do those simulations and to understand what would happen when the traveling wave going down the transmission line, power transmission line. And so these were done with miniature components. You don't have a whole transmission line, but you would have a component that represented the transmission line. And it was approximation because there were other secondary effects and tertiary effects. And so until the 70s, and I believe even the early 80s, calculations was being done on probably hybrid computers with the model of what you're trying to understand being analog components. And that's sort of blows my mind that today computers are fast enough and powerful enough to model things that couldn't be modeled digitally years ago.
Right. Yeah. No, it's amazing. And now we have distributed computing. When we think of these programs like BOINC and SETI at Home and Protein Foldings and the World computing grid. Is that right? World Computing Grid. I think is that what it's called, Mike? Is
World
that
Community Grid,
Community Grid, where we can take,
the IBM project.
yeah, we can offload some of this computing onto other people's computers, and they can be computated and then sent back, which I think is, you know, pretty amazing, all in itself. You know, we have excess. I think, Eric, the amazing thing is when we have excess computer power now, right? I mean, it's in those days, it was like if you used a computer, it took so much energy and so much time. I remember stories of old database guys telling me they programmed for data in every single block. Like, it was expensive. Hard drive storage was expensive. And so they were very judicious about where data went and how they put data. And now Mike and I are talking about using hard drives to do coin mining, right? You know, and we're like, how big of a drive are you going to use? I don't know. I'll put a 6 terabyte drive on there. Well, I'm going to do 8, right? The whole world didn't even have 8 terabytes. You know, it probably in the middle 60s when we think about what hard drive space was. So that's pretty, Eric, that's pretty amazing to me when we think about that. You kind of lived through that.
Yeah. Another amazing thing is I worked at in the 80s at ConEd's Energy Control Center. The computer used for dispatching generation was analog. It was a digital computer that was used for other purposes, but it had 32K of core memory. And the bootloader was paper tape.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. When you say paper tape, do you mean the reel to reel kind,
Yes.
or the, yeah. Okay. And it had holes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So
yeah, Mike, you've never seen that.
No, well, no. So that's why, here's my question. So if we were doing this podcast in, I don't know what a good year to pick is, 75, let's just pick 75. If you were doing this podcast in 1975, did you have the same mindset back then of like, oh my gosh, look how far we have come. It's just insane how far things have gotten to here. Or was there a time before we got to this kind of boom, I guess, of technology where you would have said, things are, I mean, maybe we'll hit a technology boom, but we really haven't hit it yet?
Great question.
I think we're, you know, sort of a hockey stick. We're you know, we're slowly going up, and then with the advent of microelectronics.
Okay. So what year does it start to go up? Like, where would you have, generally, where would you place that?
85, 90.
85?
90.
That is a great question, Mike. I love what you, though, at what point, Eric, when we think, because like today we think we're on that rise of the hockey stick, but we have no concept of what's ahead, right? And this could be the beginning, like where it just, you know, it goes up. In the 70s, though, when you were thinking about technology, did you have the wonder and amazement of some of the things? And Mike, 75 is probably a bad year. I think 80 would probably be a better, if we were to pick a point in time. Eric, when you thought about the 80s, did you have the wonder and amazement? I mean, I was just enthralled. Like, we had some great stuff coming, and I thought I lived in the future, to answer your question, Mike.
Yep.
I really did. I was like, in 84, I was doing my very first basic programming on an 8088 and an Apple IIe, right? And I thought, holy crap, because I lived in the Bay Area, right? And we had access to all those guys. And both Apple and Hewlett Packard at the time gave away computers to the schools to start funneling those things out there, right? And so we were one of the first schools to have this big computer lab. And I remember thinking, holy crap, I am in the future, right? So if you would have asked me, Eric, I would have thought that at that moment, I would have thought we were on a hockey stick, that we had all this great computing power. And by the way, the little 3-inch floppies came out in those years, and we'd been using 5 1/4 before. And I was thinking, oh, you can carry these in your pocket, and they got a little slider, you know, that would cover. Remember, the slider would cover the drive, and I could put it in my pocket and it wouldn't get ruined, because you couldn't do that with a 5 1/4 because it would fold, and you know, you could wreck it, kind of thing. And I remember thinking we're in the future. Eric, did you have those same thoughts in the 80s? Like, man, the future is here.
It was getting there. I mean, the slope of innovation was greater in the 80s than in the 70s and in the 60s. You know, part of it had to do, you know, with the electronics coming down to the consumer, and companies competing to build better products. Phone system prior to the breakup of Bell and the advent of cellular phones was monopolies,
Yeah.
primarily AT&T.
Yeah. Do you think that breakup was important? I mean, do you think innovation began to grow? I mean, they're back together for the most part, but it's a different world than it was.
That's right.
Then, do you think that was important? That breakup was really important for innovation?
I think it contributed to it.
Yeah.
Computing was dominated by IBM. There were secondary players like Control Data Corporation, General Electric, Univax, Sperry Univax. And again, with inertia, if you bought a Sperry Univax, you're probably stuck with it if they can meet your requirement, hardware requirements, because the cost of moving software even back then was very challenging. And I think when you got to an area where, a market where it was a consumer market, where there was a large consumer market, we could invest a lot and spread the cost of R&D among millions of people rather than hundreds of entities, you can make that large capital investment.
Yeah. Brian in the chat room says 81, 82, 83 for the very first PCs. Then 94 was really that year. I think the 480 was it 94 for the 486. I think it was in that middle 90s. Yeah. So I think there were some jumps in the mid 80s, another big jump in the mid 90s. And then of course, at the end of the 90s, we really saw the internet come on, and that kind of changed everything.
Yeah. See, and that was kind of my point, is so I was born in 91. And so you think even 94, I'm only 3 years old. So I feel like I've lived through an era where nothing has been too, oh my gosh, can you believe how far we've come? We've just been in this steady, yeah, that makes sense from where we were a year ago. Like everything has made sense. There hasn't been this drastic, hockey stick was a perfect example of how to put that. And it's like, okay, so the internet, maybe you could kind of talk about when the internet came out. I remember AOL first coming out with instant messenger, and that being a big change. So maybe I lived through one. But it's been pretty steady in my lifetime.
You saw the smartphone though, Mike. You saw 2000. Brian just said this, or no other Jim said then 2000 for smartphones. True. You saw a smartphone, and that changed things. That's a huge.
But it was a very natural progression. There was flip phones, and then there was a Palm Trio that my dad had, and then the iPhone. It was the Blackberries. Trios, and then the iPhone came out, which kind of iPhone was revolutionary, which the way no keyboard, right? And then
so you see that as incremental as opposed to
more as incremental. Okay. I mean, especially since I was in 7th grade, I had a Palm Pilot, and those Palm Pilots were handheld computers. They just didn't have the phone connectivity on them yet. You didn't have a connection everywhere. You needed to sync the device. You didn't have anything to connect it to.
You mentioned AOL and AIM, by the way. Emily puts in the chat room, tomorrow's their last day.
Oh, is it really? I didn't know that.
They shut down on the 15th. So isn't that weird to think the millions of people, for a generation lived on an AOL instant messaging? Right?
You can't hear a artificial door close without thinking of someone else signing out. That, all the sound effects,
ICQ and AOL and AIM, right? Those were the early days. ICQ was a forerunner. Is that the right word? A forerunner to AOL instant messaging. It was before. Yeah. It's one of the very first kind of early messaging clients. It's what's so funny is it's that whole idea of messaging has never gone away. We message exactly the same way.
Right.
Now we have emojis and animojis and
Bitmojis
that we did Bitmojis that we didn't have then. But it started with messaging that way, and yet today we still message, whether it's text or messenger or those. Eric, how does your family? You've got kids and grandkids, and how does your family communicate with each other? When you think of, have you found a central thing that you use as a family to communicate with each other?
We use a couple things. We use Hangouts.
Really?
We have video conferencing.
Okay.
I thought that was my wife.
Okay.
7:00. How will we find Hangouts? doesn't work when you have a lot of people on the phone.
Right. Yeah.
And
No.
and it doesn't work well if you're just one-on-one. So we use Google Duo.
Oh, really?
Wow. That's not what I expected.
How does that work out?
That's pretty good because you could use it on an iPhone or an Android phone.
Yeah, that's why I asked, because it was one of those that is cross-platform.
What's platform? Because my sons are both Android people, and one actually is in the hardware group at Google. So I'm a turncoat for.
Well, that's okay. Those wars don't exist anymore.
We had our last. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I said, and my dad's, I'm fortunate he's still alive, but it can't be too complex. So I will use FaceTime with him.
Okay. It's one of those built-in, easy to do, right? It just works.
Right, and Duo's that way, but more difficult getting him to use Duo.
Right.
Yeah, eventually you do, it works. Mike, you were going to say something.
Yeah, we had our last convert. So on my wife's side of the family, everyone was on an iPhone except for her mom. Her phone her phone got so old, she had an Android phone, that she would launch Snapchat and it shut down the entire phone. So I went, and this is why I got handed the 10, and I wiped and redid her 6S and gave it to her mom. I just set everything up. I said, I will set it all up. Will you switch to an iPhone? Because you're the one person causing all of our messages to be green. We can't use iMessage, and we can't, she can't FaceTime Emmett and stuff like that. And she's like, yeah, and so I set it all up for her. I set up an Apple ID, everything, gave it to her. And now I think she's actually pretty happy with it. So we're all finally on one ecosystem. On my side, we're all iPhone. But on hers, her mom was the last one to switch over. It's been a slow process. They were all non-iPhone before I joined the family.
It's important.
I've converted them all.
It's important. Like, this has become a question that has become more and more important in the last couple of years of families communicating and how they're going to do it. I think for a long time it was spread all over the place, or they used text, and it was hard, right?
Yeah.
And I've gotten this feeling in the last couple of years that it's starting to boil down to just a few things. We use Messenger, Facebook Messenger, and that works really well for us. But it's incredible the ecosystem you have to get into and find for the family, because it is frustrating when everybody's trying to use one thing and there's a holdout, right?
Yes.
And you're like, could you just get on the network or whatever?
Yeah.
Whatever it's going to be. So that seems to be the new thing recently, is how do you communicate as a family? How do you find that common ground?
Well, and it's too, for them, I'm the support guy, right? I'm the IT guy in the family, and they just know it works a lot better. I don't have to have my phone in front of me. I can walk them through steps just in my mind on how an iPhone or a Mac computer, whereas if it's Windows or an Android, I have to get on my device and be like, okay, you go here, and kind of walk them through it. So it's a little bit easier for me to support them if they're all in the same ecosystem.
Eric, your first PC was an 8088, right? You had a luggable.
Yes, I had a compact luggable.
How was it? Do you miss it? I mean, okay, certainly it's slow today. It's, it couldn't keep up, those kinds of things. But do you have fond memories of kind of that first PC?
The keyboard was a solid keyboard, not the, real springs, very well made.
Yeah.
The circuit board and the cage was made with, cage was real metal, nothing, no plastic or.
Yeah. How big was the hard drive in it?
It didn't come with one. I put a 10 megabyte drive.
Do you remember how much that was?
About $500. But okay. But there's a story that goes behind it.
Man, $500.
I want to hear it. Go.
Okay, so had the computer apart, put the drive in, booted up, perfect. Assembled the enclosure, worked, let it run for a while, stopped working. Just, right after I bought it. So I went down to the store and I brought my computer with it, the luggable, and he did it.
At 40 pounds, luggable.
Yeah. That's why I leaned to one side. He says, "Oh, it's working." I said, "Put the cover on." And that was $500. He didn't want to eat $500.
Mm-hmm.
But when he saw that, he honored the warranty
Right.
and gave you a new drive. When the enclosure in, and he saw that
Because it was the drive was heating up, right?
heating up.
Yeah. And so it'd heat up and then stop.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, it'd heat up and stop working.
Right,
It was real
right.
common. I mean, the old solid, not solid state, but the old circuitry just did not handle heat very well.
Right. And
And
it's probably had marginal characteristics. But I learned from that, or I learned from something else. I had a Chrysler Cordoba, and if anybody my age remember, was soft with Richard. I forgot the guy's name. Soft Corinthian leather. The car, I take it out of the garage. I get a block, and it died. And I said, okay. I'm still within walked home. Got a bag of ice. Put it on the control module. It was one of the early solid state control, fuel control modules.
Yeah.
It worked. So
Yep.
it was happening, and I said, okay. Went down. Nobody would ask for they finally were able to get me a control module, put it in, never had a problem.
Yeah.
Heat has always
Heat
has been an issue for
heat and
Okay.
solid state never got along really well.
right. Heat
And
and
you
plus
would
in an engine compartment, and you know how hot an engine compartment can get. So, sometimes when I deal with technology, I'm a little more knowledgeable than your average consumer. So.
Eric, a great conversation with you tonight. Thanks for jumping in here. Can you stay around, do some post show with us? Would that be
Sure.
Would that be all right? We'll continue this on to the post show.
So
when
it's not 2 hours.
no, you could drop anytime you want. And I've been drinking water, so I am I've been prepping for that. Just a reminder to folks, we make the post show available through for our Patreon subscribers. So if you want to, and it's not always very long. Mike and I had a marathon one last week, but typically they're about 30 minutes of additional audio of things that you hear as we're doing. So head over to theaverageguy.tv, click on the Patreon link. $1 gets you in. It's great. Those folks that support us help me do some things that I need to do to keep the network up and running. So I appreciate you guys doing that. And if you want to get access to the pre and the post show, pre-show is usually only about 5 minutes, but the post show usually or sometimes has some interesting stuff in it. Don't forget, we had Larry and Kat on from Ghost Browser a couple weeks ago, and we're doing the December Ghost Browser Challenge. If you haven't tried it out, head out to ghostbrowser.com. Give Ghost Browser a try. Very interesting. It's just a different kind of browser. And if you want to do something other than Chrome or Firefox, and it's actually kind of Chrome on steroids, there's some really cool things you can do with it. Give it a try. We're going through the challenge. I've been using it here and giving it a try. It works for everything I need it to work for. One of the cool things that I like about it, I mentioned this last week, if you close it and reopen it, so don't take any tabs down. Don't close any tabs. Just close it and then open it back up. All the tabs are there. It's really cool. Now, like I said, there's other plugins that do that, but it's really convenient just to have that work right out of the box with Ghost Browser. Give it a challenge. We're trying it out for the month of December. Ghostbrowser.com. Give it a try. Thank Larry and Kat for coming on here. That was a fun interview as well. And we've had a good month with them. Don't forget, also, if you want to contact me, send me some feedback. If you Eric, you are the first to make it through the vintage series. Congratulations, by the way. You set the bar for people. This is exactly what I was hoping for, that we could just have this really cool conversation where we could kind of reminisce. Eric's got some specialty in some areas, and we didn't cover everything. So Eric, at some point I'll have to have you back on again, and we'll have to cover some more stuff.
Sure.
Right? We didn't cover everything. You had some serious notes. So you're in typical lawyer fashion, way more to talk about than you needed.
Hey, Jim, can I just say something?
Yeah.
For all those listeners, support the show. Join Patreon.
Thank you.
Jim works hard. He does a good job. When I used to commute, he was there with me.
Hey,
he didn't know that, but he was.
A little scary. When was the? No, I'm just kidding. When was the first? Do you remember the first time you listened, and what was it? Was it home service show, or do you remember what was the first thing you listened to?
It was definitely a home service show, because I was putting together a home server, and I was on some forum, and then I saw McCabe's podcast, and then I started listening.
Okay. So you
Then we
found me
went-
through you found me through Home Service Show. I'm always interested how folks find it. Well, Eric, you did a great job tonight, and you've set the standard for that. If you're interested in doing this, if you want to jump in, I just need what Eric did is a couple months ago, I said, hey, and we're looking to do some back in the day kind of stuff. And if you're interested and you got something you want to talk about, give me a jingle. And so send me an email, jim@theaverageguy.tv. And we will get you. I'll do a call. Eric and I got together for about an hour one time. We just kind of chatted, and I was like, "Yeah, you got to have a little decent equipment, something we can hear you with, and some adequate bandwidth, those kinds of things." And we get you scheduled for the show. Got plenty of spaces throughout 2018 to get you involved. So if you want to do that, jim@theaverageguy.tv, or shoot me a note over on Twitter, just @Collison. Don't forget the AverageGuy.tv platform, both web and media hosting, powered by Maple Grove Partners. We love those guys over there. Gary and Christian do a great job, and you can get secure, reliable, high-speed hosting from people that you know and you trust. For more information, visit maplegrovepartners.com, and of course, you can get plans there for $10. And then, last but not least, don't forget our mobile app is available out there at homegadgetgeeks.com, sponsored by LastPass, and we appreciate their sponsorship of the program as well. It really pays to get the app developed through Spreaker, and everybody has said there's lots of great ways. The best way to listen to the show live is on Spreaker. By the way, before I go, Mike Wieger, great having you back, by the way. 2 weeks in a row.
2 weeks in a row. And hey, I think this is like I got paternity, not
There you go.
maternity. I got paternity leave
That'd
coming
be a miracle if it was.
I think this could be a thing for the next at least month. We'll see.
Oh, man.
And then word is I got an Omaha project after that. So you might not want me, but you might have me.
I like it.
for the next,
I like it. I like having
next
you.
few months if it all works
I
out.
know.
So.
I like having you back. So
Good
it's
stuff.
good to have you around. You made a few changes in the back of your.
I did. I moved some stuff around. I didn't want to highlight a drill and screwdrivers. I wanted to highlight the drone and the cameras and the camera gear and microphones. So those are all here.
Yeah, cool. Moved it around. Sarah mentioned we were talking. She was down here. She was, hey, nice background. And then you were like, yeah, I could probably move some stuff around. And
she did. Yeah, she was the cause of it. And then I added pegboard to my server rack, which I posted on Facebook about, so I can hang more stuff over there. She just got me all into organization.
Nice. Well, it's looking good. You have to see the video. If you're listening to the audio, you have to just jump out to YouTube and at least check out the audio. You can head out to theaverageguy.tv/HGG337. I know that's too long to remember. Just 337 and then throw the HGG in there. And you can get that. You can watch the video with Mike's pretty awesome background. We are live every Thursday, 8 p.m. Central, 9 Eastern, out here at theaverageguy.tv live. We'll be back next Thursday. I was just going to take a peek and see what we have on the schedule, because it's always kind of nice to know. And so, I think we're doing the drone show next week. I think we have Keith and Dave. Yeah, this is the 21st.
Oh,
You'll be here, right? So we're up for the.
Yeah, I'm definitely here.
Okay, good. Drone show next week.
Coming out right then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here.
Well, we'll figure it out. We'll get that figured out. And then Braaron's back. Paul Braaron is back to talk about. He's going to do an old school segment like this, a vintage. I'm calling it an old school vintage segment. Talk about some of the stuff he did. And then I got this really interesting interview coming up with Heather Welch. She's in New Zealand and she's off grid, and she's done a whole bunch of stuff to manage. And she's not one of these crazy off grid, like trying to get away from the government kind of thing. They had to go off grid because it literally cost $30,000 to run power to a new house they were building. And they said, hey, wonder if we could go off grid. And there's a bunch of great technology around solar and the stuff.
So just power off grid. Okay.
Power off grid.
I gotcha.
No,
how's she gonna get on the show if she's off grid?
If you listen, I had a great conversation with her. She's got internet and it's a modern home, but they're just off the power grid, right? If you Google right now anything on YouTube that's off grid, it's crazy out there.
It is.
Holy God. So not that kind of off grid. This is, so you're gonna like that. You're gonna want to tune in here. She's jumping in here on the 11th of January. So those are the shows that are coming up. We'll go into the post show, and we'll thank everybody for coming out tonight. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.